Hello again, Quarantographers. Hopefully everybody's happy and healthy and shooting. I'm here again with yet another installment of Reverse Engineering Light. I had another great submission by Ben Lindblom. Thank you so much, Ben. And this time the photograph is by photographer Dexter Navy. Thanks again for being a good sport, Dexter. This is a really cool usage of lighting, and actually, unfortunately, one that I couldn't get 100% in studio. However, I can get you close. There are unfortunately some aspects to the lighting, specifically the crisp edged lines that require a specific kind of light that I just don't have in my home studio. I'll get into that in a minute. But what we're looking at here is actually a fairly simple in concept lighting setup. Let's break it down from fill to keys. Looking at this image, the vast majority of it is actually fill only, which is kind of an odd way to put it. If most of your image is exposed only by one light, you could reasonably call that a key, but I'm going to go with the terminology fill here just because it is the lower exposure portion of the image. What I'm seeing is a large swath of this image in pure red, and in the shadows, let's take a look at the nature of this fill. It's red. Let's start there. It's definitely red. And how you achieve that? You simply put a red gel over your light. Tricky thing about color gels, to get this deep of a saturation in your image, you really need to make sure you don't get any contamination from any other color, which we'll get into when I start discussing the key. But the important thing to note is you have to kind of very much carefully dial in your exposure with a red gel like this. If you expose too high, it starts turning a little bit closer to white. It's better to keep it a little bit deeper. That way you get this really deep crimson coloring. So yeah, that fill is a red gelled light, but what of its size and shape? Taking a look at the nose of our subject, on the camera right side you can see an area that's not lit by the yellow, but is nonetheless casting a shadow. A fairly hard-edged shadow. It's not a completely hard-edged shadow. So I'm willing to bet that's a fairly small light that's been maybe diffused ever so slightly. I would say a bare reflector, maybe even a beauty dish. Depending on how far away you put these lights from your subject, its relative size is going to change, and these different reflectors are going to have different effects. For argument's sake, let's say it is a regular small reflector. On top of that, we have a sheet of diffusion, just to kind of make that small reflector point into maybe an 8-inch wide source. Other clues to that are also that her camera right cheek is completely in darkness. The camera right side of her hand is completely in darkness. But even within these shadows, you're getting some fairly harsh highlights from, say, her earring and little glints off of her ring. Finally, you can see that her hat is actually picking up a little bit of this light as well. On top of that, you have two other lights. My first impulse here was that it was maybe one light with a kind of cross pattern gobo in it, but if you look closely, check out the shadow her nose is casting on the camera left side. We have a very hard little shadow on the camera left side of her nose, and that's from this key. You can also see a small hard catch light in her camera right eye. The camera right side of her face and ear are catching this light, and the camera left side is in shadow, which tells me that this one horizontalish stripe is coming from camera right. Meanwhile, there's this verticalish stripe, which I think is coming from camera left. The clues here are, look at her camera left shoulder. See how bright it is? Remember what I mentioned about red light immediately kind of losing its saturation when it's contaminated with any other color? That's what's happening here. Her camera right shoulder is reading almost normally. The red and the yellow are almost canceling out. Meanwhile, if you look behind her on the camera right side, you can actually see a little shadow from her shoulder, that little rounded bit there. That tells me we have two different lights hitting her face and her shoulder. So what about the shape? And this is the tricky thing. The shape of these key lights is defined by a cookie or cucaloris or gobo or go-between. Interchangeable terms. Cookie or gobo. A cookie or gobo is anything that cuts light into a specific shape. And there are certain rules kind of governing how to do this. Without using a specific light, the best way to get a hard-edged cutout like this is to put this cutout very close to your subject and far from your light. If you put it really close to your light, then suddenly the edges of this become a little softer and it becomes a less specific shape. Alternately, there is a kind of light called an ERS, ellipsoidal reflector spotlight. You don't really need to know that, that's an old theater term for me. An ERS uses two lenses to focus light into a very specific hard-edged spotlight. And within the chamber of this light, there's a point at which light converges to a single point. And at that point, you can insert a gobo or cookie on the light that will give that light the hard-edged version of that cookie. You can also focus the light to adjust how sharp it reads. The bad news is, the only flash I'm aware of that accepts cookies like that and has this lens set up, this ERS lens set up, is the Profoto Zoom Spot, which is actually discontinued and only can be rented. It's a great light. You can still rent it. I'd recommend it. It's a lot of fun. But needless to say, I did not have the resources to rent 2 of them just for this tutorial. So you'll see I actually tried to muck around a bit with cutouts close to my face, but the problem there is, in order to cut that light that far from the source, I'd have to funnel the light all the way to me to avoid it spilling out and ruining the red film. So I ended up compromising. I made a long snoot out of cinefoil, and at the end of it, made a little cutout. But you'll see the version I came up with is not quite as perfect in its execution. Finally, one thing to mention here, if you look really closely, there's some pieces of clear tape on it. I puzzled over this for a bit. I was wondering if maybe he was just shooting through a piece of gel that he had taped over. That's one interesting way to get a red cast over your image, is just to shoot your camera through a gel. But then I looked through Dexter's Instagram and I noticed that Scotch tape is actually kind of a motif of his. It shows up in a lot of images, and ones where he's clearly printed them out and taped them together. So I think what's happened here is that he printed out his image and put some tape over it in an artistic way. It's my professional opinion that that's also probably where the black stripe on the camera right side came from. In conclusion, a fairly straightforward, in theory, light setup. Red fill, 2 goboed keys. But in practice, it takes a little bit of doing to make happen. Easiest way is to rent a bunch of expensive gear. Cheapest way is a bit of a hassle. Let's go to the studio. So I've kind of broken my cardinal rule of building from fill here. I got really excited about these gobos and I decided to start with that light. I've specifically chosen these speed lights for the gobo lights because speed lights have some of the hardest edged light out there. They have these micro lenses on the front of them that kind of focus light in a way that you don't necessarily get from a larger tube that you might find on a studio strobe. So you'll see that even later on when I bring in a studio strobe for the red fill, I keep using these speed lights for the yellow hard light. So here I am just testing the shape of the eye light. The camera right flash is just poking out of the right edge of frame there. Keeping in mind that I have a longer nose than the subject in the original photo, I'm trying to mimic the shadow that you're getting from her nose, knowing that eventually I'm going to be narrowing this light down to a much smaller sliver. I noticed that small sliver of shadow from her shoulder is a little on the softer side, so here I'm trying a softer light for that. This ended up to be way too soft, so I ended up swapping it for just covering the flash in a small amount of diffusion. In the end, the softness probably had more to do with the distance between her shoulder and the backdrop than any sort of diffusion, so this was kind of a waste of time. Another interesting realization here was that the shadow from her shoulder was running a bit higher than her, which means that the light lighting it was actually fairly low. So here I am lowering that well below nose height to try and get that shoulder shadow about where it is in the original image. So here you can see I've actually cut my first gobo, and I'm using that to try and approximate the eye hole. So here, as you can see, I'm starting to get a sort of a hard-edged light on that gobo, but because it's only a small strip, there's a big white area around it where the light is also coming through. Once we get a red fill in there, that's going to be a major issue and it's going to keep that red from being red. So I need to address that once I have this shape. That's about the right size and distance. It could be a harder edge if I brought it closer to my face, but then the gobo would be in frame. These are all the issues you have to deal with if you don't have an internal gobo for your flash. Here, bringing the second gobo in for the shoulder shadow, it's just pretty much in frame. You see it's casting this large light stand shaped shadow across the background. Once again, the only way this would work is if I completely controlled the spill between the flash and this small strip. An interesting feature these speed lights have is you can zoom the light. It's measured in millimeters like a lens. These flashes go from 24 to 200, and at the 200 end it's almost like adding a grid to your flash. It really narrows the spread, and that's mainly what I have going on here. I've just narrowed the spread down to 200 just to see how bad that spill is now. Obviously it's still very much exceeding the bounds of the gobo. So the next step here is to build an actual snoot out of cinefoil. A snoot just kind of channels the light down into this very small point. And here you can see I've pretty much entirely gotten rid of any spill. This gobo is basically functioning as intended, though I haven't yet gelled it yellow. Here I am before I go on any further. I'm going to gel both of these flashes yellow. I've also built a snoot for the other light here, though as I'm about to find, the combination of snoot plus diffusion on this left light means I have very little light left to play with at the end of the day. Eventually, I realize I should have taken the diffusion off. So that yellow eye light is more or less where I want it to be. Looks like there's some minor spillage there on the camera right side. But this left one's giving me a lot of guff. Not sure I ever quite get it exactly where I want it to be. Here I am bringing an extra big piece of show card to block most of that light. It already has a hole in it that I use for close-up camera stuff where I don't want the reflection of the camera in the shot. So now I have this elaborate setup with a snoot and a large flag and a small hole, and I just have very little light coming through for this part of the shot, and it's very hard to aim. This would be tremendously easier with a zoom spot. Having gotten fairly close and wanting to clear my head a little bit, I decide to turn off these yellow keys and start perfecting my red fill, which is a little bit more straightforward. I have a piece of full stop diffusion on this bare reflector, as well as straight up red. My first placement wasn't quite extreme an angle enough, so I'm moving it to the corner of my room. And given that I've started playing around with hand placement, you can tell I'm feeling pretty good about this general light look. So because I'm so worried about spill, I've basically given up on the elaborate cutting mechanisms that I had earlier. Instead, I have taken the opening that I was using earlier as a gobo, and I've just placed it directly at the end of the snoot, just eliminating all possibility of extra spill. Unfortunately, that also means I'm not going to have as hard an edge here, but at this point, I'm willing to make that sacrifice. And as you can see at this point, it's actually a pretty decent effect. It's a wider spread, it's less precise, but it gets the point across. I'm not the craftiest person in the world. I'm sure some of you could do better at this. Here I've finally seen the light, so to speak, and am taking off this diffusion that is just eating up so much of this second flash for no reason. And it's pointed directly at my face here, which is not helpful. You can't really see it. It needs to be pointed at my camera left shoulder and missing my face. At this point, you're starting to get a bit of each. We've got the eye light, and you see this shoulder shadow on the camera right side. Unfortunately, we're starting to get a bit of extra spill. That's why this red's turning orange, and you can see a little bit of the edges of my head shadow. It's just sort of the limits of this crafty cinefoil-based solution. It's not the best way to go about this. But eventually I come to a point that I feel like is pretty respectable. It's definitely not the exact original image, but it's inspired by it, and it sets the mood nicely, and to my taste, I actually kind of like the softer edged snoot look rather than the hard gobos. It tells a different story, but I think it's an equally valid one. So yeah, that's reverse engineering light for the day. Thank you so much for sending these in. These have been a real treat to do. I'd love to do more, so if you have an image that's really stumping you, please send it in. I'd love to take a crack at it. If you'd like to join our community and discuss more in depth, please consider joining the Patreon. It's only $5 a month. We have a wonderful Discord where people ask questions and receive feedback. I'm in there a lot, so you can ask me questions directly. It's just been a really valuable resource during these times to foster a sense of community. Thank you so much for watching. As ever, stay safe, stay sane, stay shooting. Thank you very much.